Thank you for the invitation to speak. It's been a broad and very interdisciplinary conference so far, and now I'm going to pivot and take us in a new direction. I'm an evolutionary ecologist, and so I'm going to tell you a little bit about my work, sort of melding social behavior with thinking about how organisms cope with environmental variation. So we all know that the world is changing. We're cutting down our forests, we're desertifying our landscapes, we're pumping lots of CO2 into the atmosphere. This has major implications. We're changing the temperature of the Earth. That's what people most often think about. But there are other things too, and one of the key changes of all these land use changes and whatnot is that we are changing the climate in a variety of ways. In addition to raising the temperature, we're creating more storms, droughts are becoming more frequent. Basically, extreme weather events are becoming more frequent and occurring in places where they typically didn't happen. So snowstorms in parts of the world that don't typically get snow. Where I come from, hurricanes that are destroying major cities. I would argue that if we want to start to understand how organisms are going to cope with these changing climates, particularly vertebrates, it'll help to first understand how animals cope with natural levels of environmental variation. So studying organisms in environments that are variable, in environments where they've evolved over thousands of years, we can begin to start to make predictions about how organisms elsewhere are going to cope with these major environmental changes. And that's what I want to talk about today. So I want to give you some snippets in three parts. First, I want to talk about the behavioral adaptations that organisms use to cope with these environments. I'll talk about some of my work studying social behavior, particularly cooperative breeding, and some ideas about how some of these adaptations may be similar to bet hedging strategies. And then I'll switch gears and talk a little about physiological flexibility and how hormonal responses and adaptations to the environment are molded in these animals. And then finally, I'll try to bring this together in a theoretical framework where we think about the different ways that animals adapt to these changing environments. And this is where we'll get into tipping points and think about the types of environments that are going to lead towards tipping points in the case where populations lead to crash and eventually extinction, and some of the adaptations that allow organisms to not go over these tipping points. So let me start by telling you about these behavioral adaptations in birds. And we'll ask, does environmental uncertainty influence social evolution? Going back now 30 or 40 years, biologists recognized the importance of environmental factors in shaping social evolution. These are typically thought of as of spatial constraints in the landscape, limited territories, limited food, and this influences the decisions by organisms to disperse, to stay home, and form family groups. And what I want to talk today is not about that, but how changing environments might also influence dispersal decisions, the formation of family groups, and ultimately individuals forgoing their own reproduction to help raise others' offspring. And that's the definition of cooperative breeding, which we'll talk about. I'm going to give you examples in a few ways. First, I want to talk comparatively, looking at broad-scale patterns across first African starlings and then more generally across all of the birds in the world. And this is some comparative work we've done with a few collaborators over the years. And then I'll focus in on one species, a species of African starling that we've been studying for 15 years now, talk about some of its behavioral roles, life history patterns, and then look at how the environment shapes fitness. And this is, again, it's a long-term study. There's been many students, but we work year-round with a team of Kenyans collecting data on a large population, and I'll tell you a little bit about that. So first, let's focus on these broad-scale patterns, and we'll start in Africa, sub-Saharan Africa. There are about 120 species of starlings in the world. You're probably most familiar with the European or the common starling, which you have in North America. It was introduced into Central Park in the 1800s, so it's not native to here. Or if you've gone to Hawaii, you've seen some of the mynas. They're also in the starling group. In Africa, we have 45 species of starlings. They're very diverse. You can just see the plumage patterns. They've got crests, they've got tails, they've got skin patches. We study a lot of why these birds have these ornaments. But I'm not going to talk about that today. What I'm going to talk about specifically is their social behavior. They're an interesting group, probably one of the most interesting groups of birds, because about 60% of the species are your typical non-cooperative breeder. There's pair bonding birds. A pair will lay eggs. The eggs will hatch. babies will disperse and form their own group. But about 40% are what we call cooperative breeders. They're groups of individuals, so offspring fail to disperse, they remain home, and they help raise their relatives. So they can get the genetic, inclusive fitness benefits, the genetic benefits of raising kin. What's nice about starlings is you see the whole range of vertebrate social systems within this group of 40 individuals, 40 species. So most species are your typical, a single pair, one or two helpers that tend to be offspring from previous generations that stick around for a year or two to raise their siblings. But you also see extremes like this one, the superb starling, which I'll tell you about later, lives in very complex groups, multiple breeding pairs, multiple non-breeding individuals that help raise offspring at a variety of nests. So they're very complex societies, in many ways akin to human societies. So let me step back. So the first thing we wanted to look at was, is there a relationship between the social behavior that we see across these 45 species and the habitats in which they live? And these birds live throughout sub-Saharan Africa, primarily in savanna woodland habitats and in forested habitats. And if you do a large-scale comparative analysis, we've built molecular phylogenies of the group, collected lots of life history data on these species, what you find is that the cooperative species tend to only be found in these savanna environments. And the non-cooperative or non-social species tend to be found in these forested environments. Now, this isn't too terribly surprising, because if you go to parts of the world where there's lots of cooperative breeders, places like Australia, where pretty much 1 out of every 3 or 4 birds you see is probably a cooperative breeder, we know they occur in these savanna woodlands environments. But we wanted to ask, what was it about these environments that might promote the formation of family groups, individuals living and cooperating together, and some individuals forgoing their own reproduction to help raise others' offspring. Now, if you've ever spent time in sub-Saharan Africa, you'll know that rainfall drives much of the ecology and the behavior and life history of the organisms that live there. So things like the classic wildebeest migrations are driven by rainfall driving grass resources, impacting how the animals move on the landscape. So if you just look at, say, rainfall patterns in one of these sites, this is one of my study sites here, it looks messy. How do we, it almost looks like a heart cardiogram that we saw yesterday. And I guess this is a good one. So how do we interpret this? Well, we need to step back. And so, okay, here are four cardiograms, I guess. Which one would be your preferred one? What I'm showing here actually is time versus some climate measure. This could be temperature, this could be rainfall. And how we think about these patterns of climate on the landscape, I think has important implications for understanding how birds adapt to these environments. And so let's zoom out. And I've showed you 4 cases here, and I'm plotting variability versus predictability. So I would argue that most organisms experience some degree of variation in climate in their lives, even short-lived organisms. But the degree of predictability of that variation is quite important. So you can see here we've got seasonal variation, maybe a dry season or a wet season or summer or winter. The magnitude of that variation could be higher. But you get cases where it's quite predictable, and you get cases where it's quite unpredictable. And so in some cases, you get variable environments that are very unpredictable. And I think this looks a lot like the rainfall that we talked about. Now, when you think about variation in one of these climate measures, if you were to just plot the mean precipitation versus the variation in mean precipitation, you'll see a negative relationship like this, right? So whenever you plot the variance versus the mean, you're going to get higher variance when there's a lower mean. This is kind of what we know. So I think we need to think about interpreting climate not by looking just at variation per se, but looking at the predictable nature of that variation. So we can start by asking, what do patterns of rainfall predictability look like, particularly in this African landscape? To do that, we dove back into the ecological literature and used a measure that Robert Colwell developed about 40 years ago to measure unpredictability for temporal patterns. His unpredictability measure is the sum of 2 components. One he calls constancy, which basically measures the uniformity of occurrence through all seasons. It's essentially a measure of temporal variability, year-to-year variability. And the second is contingency, which measures the repeatability of those seasonal patterns, and it gives you sort of a crude measure of seasonality. So in a lot of these environments, the seasons are not winter, spring, or snow sort of growing season, as we would see where I'm from, but rainy season, dry season. So what we did is we dove into some long-term rainfall data, going back, in many cases, 100 years, and just wanted to see what the relationship was with these measures on the African continent. focusing in on savannas. So here again, I've plotted mean precipitation versus the three measures, predictability, then I'll show you contingency, constancy, and contingency. And I've divided it up into the three major biomes, desert, savanna, and forest. And these boundaries are driven, I mean, they're loose boundaries, but these are what the geographers tell us are the transitions between desert savanna habitats at about 100 millimeters of rainfall and savanna forest habitats at about 12 or 1300 millimeters of rainfall in Africa. What we see is that savanna environments tend to be, on average, less predictable than either deserts or forests. Of course, there's lots of variation, and it depends on the area of Africa where you're looking. And if you look specifically at the constancy term, this pattern seems to be driven by this. So savanna environments tend to be less constant or more temporally variable than either deserts or savannas, deserts or forests. And perhaps not surprisingly, savannas are relatively seasonal environments. They have a pronounced wet and dry season, just as forests. And deserts tend not to. They tend to be pretty uniform and be dry most of the time. So if you want to characterize specifically savanna environments in Africa, we would say they are unpredictable environments characterized by both high temporal variability and high seasonality. And given that this unpredictability term seems to be driven by this constancy measure, if you then go back to our life history data in Starlings, use thousands of museum records and do large GIS analysis to pinpoint the range of these birds, looking at this rainfall variation, what we find is that the cooperative breeders tend to be found in the less constant or more variable environments. So we can say, based on a group of only 45 birds on one continent, that there seems to be a relationship between the broad-scale distribution of this social behavior and the environment in which the birds live. But again, this is based on a small subset of birds. So what we wanted to do was scale up to a global analysis and basically look on much broader taxonomic and geographic scales and look at all birds. There's anywhere from 10,000 to 10,500 species on any given day, depending on how many subspecies you classify as species. And so we went into the literature and looked at most of these birds. A priori, we excluded marine species, thinking that if they're feeding on fish and things in the ocean, they're going to be driven by, they're not typically going to be driven by terrestrial weather patterns. So if we do this and look at most of the avifauna in the world, we do this to look again at temporal variability, in this case precipitation and temperature, seasonality, and annual means. We didn't use Colwell's measure here for a variety of reasons. We used bin data to look at coefficients of variation across bins, so it's quite similar to Colwell's metric. And again, we used long-term rainfall data and some published data sets here of social behavior on all of the birds in the world. First thing we wanted to do was just look at the distribution of cooperative breeders in the world. Surprisingly, this had never been done. Now, I told you before that there were places that we know have lots of social species, like Australia, New Zealand, turns out sub-Saharan Africa. Not a lot up here in the Pacific Northwest, not a lot actually in the New World. So there are places where there's a high incidence of social species and places where there are not that many. And then if you do, I'm not going to go into the details of the modeling, but if you do build a variety of models with these climate variables, including a lot of life history variables, diet, body size, things like that, what we basically find is that precipitation variation among years, so year to year, I don't know if you can see this, year to year variation is the best predictor. You can just see that red means a large number of species here, and red down here means high variation in rainfall. So precipitation tends to be a better predictor than temperature, and variation among years seems to be a better predictor than annual means, and climate seems to be overall a better predictor than some of these other life history variables. Now, these models explain a very small percentage of the data, about 14%, which is not a lot. But if you look at other avian life history traits that we know about, so things like clutch size, so there's a major trend in birds where clutch size varies as you move from latitude, from the temperate to the tropics. We've known this for 100 years. It's very pronounced. You can do the same types of models, and climate explains about 14% of the variation there too. So climate explains sort of a large amount of the variation in avian social behavior, both at the regional scale in Starlings and also on the global scale. Okay, so I want to shift gears now and go to some more empirical work focusing on one species of starling, the superb starling. We work and have worked for the last 15 years in Central Africa, in the middle of Kenya, in classic savanna bushland environment. This is a seasonal environment. This is a picture taken in the dry season. It's a little grainy for some reason. And the wet season, only about 3 or 4 weeks later. So as soon as the rain comes, the grass turns green, the trees leaf up, the insects come out, and the birds can begin building nests. They can often begin building nests within 2 or 3 days of the first rain, so it's very rapid. How they predict this is not quite known. We've been looking at some of the brain, neurons in the brain to look at this, and we think we have a handle on this, but suffice it to say, they go immediately as the rain comes. The rain is important because it drives all aspects of their lives. The rain patterns in Africa look like this. This is just an animated mean monthly rainfall map, and you can see that the monsoon rains move north and south over the equator. What this means for our study site is that we actually get a double rainy season, and the birds take advantage of this and will breed twice a year. So there's a primary breeding season about now, so the birds are in full swing. They started nesting last week this year. So birds typically begin building nests in the beginning of March, but that can be delayed until April, sometimes into May. Sometimes they're done in May, sometimes they breed all the way through June. So the length and the start of the breeding season is very unpredictable from year to year. They breed during this long rain season, and then again in the short rains. What this means is there's 2 pronounced dry seasons, and these dry seasons are the most variable and unpredictable months. So if you just plot, again, variation in monthly rainfall versus mean monthly rainfall, it's that primary dry season before the primary breeding season, which we'll call the pre-breeding period, that is the most variable and unpredictable across years. It turns out that what happens, the amount of rainfall that falls during this period predicts much of the behavior and the physiology of these birds in the subsequent breeding season. So I'll give you some examples in a second. So this is the species that we're looking at, the superb starling. I told you it's a very complex family structure. It's probably among the most complex of any bird in the world. It lives in very large groups. Average group size is 20 to 25 birds. There's usually 3 or 4 breeding pairs in a group. We call this a plural cooperative breeder. Both sexes help. Individuals can help raise young at multiple nests. Males are the primary helpers, which is what we typically see in birds, but females actually do some helping. Females are the primary dispersers, but it turns out, we've just finished some genetic work, about half of the breeding males in the group are actually not born in the group. So while these tend to be male philopatric societies of related males, it's actually a little bit more complex than we thought, and a lot of immigrant males are coming in and breeding successfully. We don't know why yet. Now, having the structure is very important because you need to have helpers at the nest. Having helpers at the nest increases reproductive success by reducing starvation and also by reducing nest predation. So every nest has at least 1 helper. If you don't have an helper, you will fail. And the size of the helpers of the nest can range from 1 to 10 or 11 birds. Now, as I said, this rainfall predicts a lot of the behavior. So if you just look at the number of first-time or the proportion of first-time breeders in the group, you get more subordinates trying to breed for the first time following wetter years and fewer following drier years. And this is not because rainfall directly influences their physiology or something. It actually influences the social conflict within the group, and the dominance will allow the subordinates to breed. It also influences odd things like the sex ratio of the offspring produced. There's a very pronounced pattern that here's some newer data, that after dry years, mothers produce male offspring 60-40, and in wet years, they produce female offspring 70-30. So pretty much anything you look at with this pre-breeding rainfall, physiology, various components of their behavior, seems to be related to what falls. The question is, what about their reproductive success? What about their fitness? This is very important. So we can quantify reproductive success in a number of ways. We've done it by just looking at the proportion of nests that fledged young. And I'll show you data from 10 years or 20 breeding seasons. Now, if you look at the variation in reproductive success across years, it's quite high. Some years they can be quite successful and fledge 80% of the young. Some years it's 0. If you extended this out to 2015, it would basically be 0, 0, 0, 0. It's been a very hard couple of years, and so life is hard, but it varies. But this variation in reproductive success does not appear to be related to the amount of rainfall that falls either during the pre-breeding period, which influences the condition of the breeders, or during the breeding period, which influences the amount of food that's available. No matter how you look at it, fitness, reproductive success, does not seem to be related to climate, mean fitness. Now, what about variation in fitness? I told you there's a lot of variation. When you start to think about fecundity variance, or variation in reproductive success, we start to think about ideas of bet hedging. Now, bet hedging is a deceptively simple idea, but I think it's actually more complex than people give it credit for. So the classic example that we're probably all familiar with is diversified bet hedging, or diversified strategies that allow you to take advantage of all, in this case, all possible environmental scenarios. Literally not laying all your eggs in one basket. This is what you do when you invest in the stock market. You should not all buy Microsoft stock. You should, God forbid, diversify and buy Google or Apple stock as well. But there are other types of bet hedging, and there's what's called conservative bet hedging, and these are conservative strategies to minimize fecundity variance across all environmental conditions. The idea is you don't want to have any zeros. You don't want to have any complete failures. So you can do this by reducing your mean, reducing your arithmetic mean reproductive success, arithmetic mean to reduce the variation, which will ultimately maximize your geometric mean. Now, this is what I want to talk a little bit more about. And we've known for about 40 years that we've known for 40 years that conservative bet hedging seems to be very rare in nature. Some ecologists would argue it does not happen and cannot happen. But in very small populations, we know that it may actually happen, and variance in fecundity may influence fitness as much as the mean. But most organisms don't live in very small populations. But it's been argued that these cooperative breeders, because of their subdivided small populations, when there isn't necessarily a lot of gene flow between them, might fit the criteria for a conservative bet hedging strategy. So we can ask, if cooperative breeding is a risk aversion strategy to maximize fitness by reducing this environmentally induced fecundity variance, then we can make some predictions. Reproductive success should be negatively related to some measure of temporal environmental variation, in this case rainfall variation. It should also be negatively related to the number of helpers in the group. And this is exactly what we find. Variance in reproductive success, here I've standardized it against the mean, so we don't have the problem with plotting variation versus a mean, decreases as the environment becomes less harsh. There's more rainfall. And similarly, the variance in reproductive success decreases as group size increases. So basically what we find is these are some relatively crude predictions about how you relate to bet hedging, but we find consistent ideas with this conservative bet hedging model. Okay, I'm going to switch gears and focus a little bit on physiological flexibility. Now, we know a lot about the vertebrate stress response, the HPA axis, and the cascade of hormones from the hypothalamus to the pituitary to the adrenals. Much of what we know actually comes from studies in temperate birds. A lot of the classic work was done around here by John Wingfield when he was at the University of Washington. So a lot of the white-crowned sparrow work in and around Washington and up all the way to the Arctic Circle. We know that rapid and temporary responses to climatic perturbations often result in the release of stress hormones. But in the tropics, we don't really know what's going on. We think they might be more flexible adaptations that allow them to cope with continual environmental uncertainty, but very few studies have looked in the tropics. So we can ask, how is the stress response shaped by living in these variable and unpredictable environments? And this is some work I've done with a collaborator and one of my students. And I'm just going to present some preliminary data. So I told you we've been working for 15 years in a savanna environment that gets about 550 millimeters of rainfall. But we've also started working over the last few years in other savanna environments and a desert environment that gets about 100 millimeters of rainfall, and some forested environments around Mount Kenya that get up to 12 or 1300 millimeters of rainfall. And then we can look at different components of the vertebrate stress response. So we can take baseline levels, which tells you something about their sort of background level of environmental or social stress. We can then do a captive restraint procedure where we keep them in a bag for 30 minutes, and they get a stress response that peaks about 30 minutes in this species. We can also give them an injection of ACTH to see what the maximal production of glucocorticoids is. So to do that, we took two different approaches. One was to compare this species, again, the superb, which is relatively cosmopolitan. It lives in savannas, but it gets on the periphery of forests and deserts. We didn't catch it in the forest for this study, but I'll return to that in a second. And if you look at, say, a cosmopolitan species and compare it to two endemics, what we found was that it has much higher levels of both baseline and stress-induced hormone levels. independent of the environment in which they live in. And so perhaps there's something related to the broad-scale distribution of this species. There is gene flow between these populations, and they must be able to cope with not only variable environments, but also a range of more predictable environments. Of course, we went back and replicated this, and the patterns all changed, right? So 2010 was a typical year. I told you 2014 was very dry. And what we see overwhelmingly in both baseline and stress-induced levels is that there are much higher hormone levels in the harsher years, and that's not a surprise. Conditions have been bad for 2 years. It's more stressful. But we seem to see more elevated responses in the more unpredictable and savanna environments here than in the desert environments. And this is what we originally thought we would see. And so perhaps we only see these in the drier years, but given that this environment has many dry years, this seems likely. So we went back then, and now wanted to look at superbs in all of these different environments. So we're just in the middle of this study, and we've looked in 5 sites now. And what you find is that in the intermediate rainfall, the savanna environments, they have much higher levels of both baseline stress-induced and, surprisingly this time, maximal ACTH levels. And if you plot that versus predictability and rainfall, there's a very nice negative relationship. So they have much higher stress responses in the more unpredictable environments. And this is what we expected, and it's nice to see, and it suggests that the degree of an unpredictable environmental variation may be shaping the stress physiology in these birds. So how does this all go together? Well, variable environments, like the ones I've been talking about, seem to pose a greater range and a higher frequency of challenges to reproduction and survival of these birds and all organisms that live in them. This has important consequences for the evolution of behavioral, morphological traits, genetic traits, physiological traits. I've given you examples of behavior and physiology. There are classic examples of Darwin's finches in the Galapagos, et cetera. And so how does this go together? Well, we know that organisms adapt in a variety of ways. And there's 3 general categories that sort of modes of evolutionary response that organisms use to adapt to this unpredictable environmental variation. The first is plasticity. The second is bet hedging, and the third is what we call adaptive tracking. So you've heard of these. So plasticity is the ability for organisms to respond to environmental cues and adjust genotypic expression accordingly, either throughout their lives. We call that developmental or reversible plasticity. So things like the helmets that Daphnia grow when they're in predator environments versus when they don't have helmets when they're in non-predator environments. I switched these, whoops. This is an example of irreversible plasticity, and then reversible plasticity throughout their lifetimes is things like coat coloration changes in some of the mammals as they change from summer to winter. Bet hedging, I told you about, these diversified strategies and these conservative strategies that may be going on. And then finally, adaptive tracking, which is simply correlated variation in mean population traits as selection favors different mutations over time. So the classic example is hominid evolution or some of the bovid evolution at the same time in East Africa. You get these long-term drying and wet trends, and populations track those changes in their sort of directional selection for traits over that period. And when you get these flips, these reverses, anthropologists would argue that these coincide with some of the important adaptations in our own species, like coming out of the forest into the savannas, like standing up bipedality, like group living, like using fires. You can argue whether those actually work, but they do coincide plus or minus 1 million years in most cases. Okay, so one of the questions we're left with, given there's all these diversity of response modes that organisms can use, when should they use one type of adaptive response over another? Okay, and this is some work that we've been doing with some theoreticians, and Carlos Botero has really used most of the model. So let me walk you very quickly, I guess, through the model. We basically wanted to model simultaneously all these potential modes of responses. And to do that, we had 2 key variables. Predictability, which I've told you a lot about. Basically, predictability is, for an organism, is how it can perceive the environment. So the environment sends out cues, and then it responds with a phenotypic response, which we call I installation. And then R is the relative time scale of the environmental variation, or the number of generations per environmental cycle. So you perceive the world very differently from, say, a Drosophila. And then we built a simulation model where we can code each of those responses with basically an underlying gene and look at how individuals respond. You can get fixed strategies where they have the same response for every type of cue. You can get plastic strategies that are reversible or irreversible, or you can get mixed strategies where some in the population will do one thing and others will do other. And then if you run this simulation, we ran simulations of 100 populations, 5,000 individuals per population for 10,000 generations, you get something like this as you vary R and predictability. And if you jump and just look at it graphically, you can actually predict which region of parameter space organisms should use which type of evolutionary response mode. In the less predictable environments, you get more bet hedging. This becomes plasticity as you move forward. And there is a region where I would say most long-lived organisms probably live, where they can use multiple things. Now, how does this relate to tipping points? Well, populations are robust to change if they fall somewhere in the middle of this parameter space. But as you get to the boundary regions between different evolutionary modes, major changes cause populations to crash and eventually go extinct as you change these boundary modes. So basically, if you vary some of the parameters in the model, you can look at how the trait values change, and you get rapid population crash. So this is not always the case. Again, we run multiple populations. Sometimes you get recovery, and it depends on certain things in the genetic architecture. But species are vulnerable to these tipping points when they lie very close to the boundaries, not surprisingly. But we can also start to understand about what else makes them vulnerable. And it's if the costs of plasticity are high, when they exhibit slow life histories, when they reproduce infrequently or produce few offspring. This characterizes most temperate organisms, so they may be in trouble. And it also depends on the genetic architecture, and this is something we're just starting to delve into. So let me end by saying that hopefully I've convinced you that the degree of unpredictable variation in climate drives broad-scale patterns of sociality in birds. It influences multiple components of their vertebrate stress response, and we're starting to just understand why. And it also influences the different types of modes of response that they use. And so understanding the significance of these adaptations, I think, is important for predicting the impacts of climate change. And in terms of tipping points, I would argue we need to understand the precise environmental conditions which place an organism near one of these boundaries. And we also then need to know the life history traits and the types of genetic architectures that are going to make some species robust and other species not robust to crossing these tipping points. Thank you.
Okay, it's open for discussion. So if anyone has a question. So we'll just allow one or two questions, because don't forget we have the discussion panel after this as well, so please save up your questions then.
Hi, Larry Samar. Wonderful talk. So one of the things I just wonder if you could comment on is most of these birds or any other vertebrate live in a very tight ecology, including insects and flowering plants and microbes and everything else. And one of the things we see in climate change is that those have developed timing of life and death cycles that are based on climate, which as they get altered, these can get out of phase, and then that becomes a major detriment. So from an ecological point of view, as opposed to individual, physiological of a particular species, could you talk a little bit about how that ripping apart of the ecological fabric by the climate change, how that rates as a problem compared to the ones you discussed?
Yeah, I think if you go back to that model, remember we had relative time scale on the bottom. And I think about long-lived vertebrates, right? So starlings live 12 to 15 years in the wild, and in captivity they can live 20 years or more. So for me, you can't vary my organisms there. But for these, I think for organisms that have shorter lifespans, like a lot of these insects and stuff, this is going to be an implication as you get this mismatch in timing. So it goes to the cues. So things like reproductive timing are driven by a number of cues. They can be by photoperiod, but they can also be by supplemental cues like the amount of food and the rainfall. And as these become mismatched, we get into sorts of problems. So the timing or the phenology of lay dates in temperate birds, all it has to do is shift by a week or two, and you get problems because the babies hatch before you get the flush of food. So in temperate climates, like I'm going to go home in a few days, and by this weekend or next week, the daffodils should be out. Spring should be here. I can predict that a week or two pretty much every year. But in Kenya, we have no predictability in those conditions and when the flush of insects comes. It could be February, it could be May. And so the birds are unable to adapt. So what they probably do is they use slightly different cues. So, I'm working literally on the equator, so there's not much photoperiodic change. Birds can respond to photoperiod on the equator, but they're probably doing some of these supplemental things. And I think those types of supplemental cues are going to be particularly important for insects and birds in the temperate region.
Sui, one question.
A brief question. So the increase of cortisol in different environments is very interesting, and but that's just a biochemical marker, right? Do you see clinical consequences like increased susceptibility to infections or longevity?
Yeah, so we're just doing that. We also look at a variety of immune function measures, and we do see trade-offs between these things. And the immune function data we haven't fully analyzed yet, but it doesn't seem to show the same pattern. They seem to maintain a similar level of immune response, but we haven't done the year-to-year variation. So when you look across, so what I haven't talked a lot about is spatial variation in this whole thing. And that's very important for both social evolution and for all of these patterns, and we're just starting to work on that. So in terms of clinical things, we know that, and I also haven't talked about social stress. These are social birds, and social stress also impacts the hormone levels, and so it's a little bit more complicated. So there are clinical implications, but they're somewhat hard to tease apart in these environments, but we're getting there.
Okay, thank you very much.